Well, good morning. Oh, come on. Good morning. Let me do a quick test. How many people in the room are part of a large organization? Raise your hand. Large organization. Company, university, government, da-da-da. Okay, other side. How many people are a part of a small organization? Okay, the people part of a small organization, this is not for you, right? You can feel free to listen in, but this is really intended for the people who work for a large organization. I'm a designer, as Martha said, I'm a designer. I joined Coke in 2004 to help us refocus how we use design to drive our business. And that was my path. That's what I've been doing for the last few years. Until about a year and a half ago. And that's when our company stepped back and looked at all the disruption actually happening in, across every industry, I'd suggest, but also all the opportunity that's coming our way, many of the things that Glenn was talking about. And put the question on the table and said, what are we not doing in terms of innovation? What are we not doing in terms of innovation? And that led us to a lot of different things, and that's essentially what I'm going to talk about today. Let's see, about 6 weeks ago, I was in Sydney, Australia, and I was asked to talk to the startup community there. And we did a quick talk, about a 15-minute talk like this, in a co-working space called Fishburners. And that was actually streamed across the country. So we really were engaging with the startup community across the country. And talked for about 15 minutes and then did a Q&A session for about an hour and a half. And it really went deep into what Martha was just talking about in terms of what we're trying to do that's different. So I got back to Atlanta. I'm based here. Got back to Atlanta, checked my Twitter feed the next day, and I had been, this blog posting had been retweeted to me over and over and over. So read the post, and essentially it says, we're doing something new, but what's the point? Coke, what's the point? And actually, I think that question is a great way to frame what I'm going to talk about. What's the point? And if you've ever tried to create change inside of an organization, you probably ask yourself, I do almost daily, again, this is really, really hard. What's the point? It's so difficult trying to change something that has existed long before you. What's the point? And then on the outside, if you're looking at Coke, large multinational company, it's quite easy to say, what's the point, Coke? Are you not big enough? You're not, what's the point? What are you doing this for? So let's jump into that. Okay, my story starts in 1996, and this is actually what the web looked like in 1996. Anybody remember that? Yeah, 1996, yeah. So just to refresh your memory, if you weren't there, this is what many people romantically call the Web 1.0, version 1.0 of the web. Back then, it was just sort of the internet, this new thing, or new media, or, called it different things, but certainly not that. And again, 100,000 websites. Today, we have over 700 million websites. So this is 100,000, early days. Before broadband, everyone, got to the internet through dial-up, which most people don't even remember what that is. But anyway, this is before Steve went back to Apple, and certainly before Google. So a couple of friends of mine, another designer, another engineer, looked at what was happening at that time, 1996. And a lot of big companies were moving onto the web or wanted to get into the web. And if you're around, if you're under 40, you probably don't remember this, but if you're over 40, you probably remember, a lot of companies were starting web pages. They called them web pages back then. We needed to design a web page. And so me and this other two guys, co-founders, started up this company, and we were simply going to help big companies move onto the web. Now, we had no idea how to do that, but nobody else did either, so we thought we could figure it out. So we started this company here in Atlanta, actually. Just remember that. Here in Atlanta, and we worked with CNN, a lot of the large companies based here in Atlanta, and we actually designed the first streaming audio and video player for CNN. And you can imagine the pain that took through dial-up, but anyway, it was what it was. So let's see, one thing that most startups struggle with, even today, is when and how to scale. So, and we experienced the same thing. So me and the other co-founders went back and forth. When the company started to take off, and actually it reached profitability in the first 3 months, which is amazing if you start anything. And so it started to take off like a rocket, but we didn't know how to scale it. And so we went back and forth, and long story short, we just couldn't figure that out. So we actually folded the company. I went on to another company quickly, within about a year. That idea of big companies moving on to the web or leveraging web-based technologies was called e-business. And again, if you remember this back in the day, if you were a company moving on to the web, you were called an e-business. And so join a company and help big companies become e-businesses. Now, at the same time, this was going on. The dot-coms were blowing up, right? And everybody has their own favorite version or story of this, but One of mine is boo.com. Does anybody remember boo.com? Yeah, real infamous story here. So they were based in London, but boo.com, like many other .coms, started with a massive amount of cash. So they blew through $70 million before they released their first product. So, okay, let me say that again. $70 million before they released their first product. Okay, and then when they released the product, they designed it for a broadband audience. Now the problem was 98% of their audience didn't have broadband, right? So they released this new product, and within 6 months, they were out of business. And so that, just symbolized the way that a lot of .coms worked back in the day. I was in New York at the time, New York City, and right around this time, 2002, all the air went out of the city, at least where I was, because that was the hotbed of that activity, at least from my perspective. And things went dark. But around 2003, 2004, this happened, or that happened. Steve Blank. Anybody familiar with Steve Blank, the lean startup? Eric Ries, any of those people that have been working on that movement. So about 10 years ago, they came up with this approach, a new approach to creating a startup. And it was fundamentally different. And it was based on these two things. Actually, starting with almost nothing, lean, very little, doing the most, the least, agile, all these things, developing something as cheaply as possible up front, and developing it with your target audience, like Sarah was talking about, working with the person that you think is going to use it right from the beginning. So working with the least amount of resources, and from the beginning with the people that you think are going to actually use the thing. Completely different approach. And this has now been called the lean startup approach or method and so forth. Okay, so that was 10 years ago. Where are we today? Today, startups are not new. Founders are not in the garage or basement or in the background. They're very much in the forefront of our society, right? Co-founders are the rock stars of the world today, right? And some of this is a little bit silly. Tech stars. Actually, how many people have seen any kind of reality show related with a startup? Yeah, reality show. Yeah, it's kind of funny, kind of silly. So that piece you could probably leave out and no one would miss it. But what is actually quite good is there are many new tools that are available for everyone. Many new tools that are available for everyone 10 years later. So let me point out some of those. Startup Weekend. Anyone been to a Startup Weekend, familiar with Startup Weekend? A few people. Startup Weekend. So Startup Weekend is a nonprofit, started about 3 years ago. That's one of the co-founders. 3 years ago, and what they do is within 54 hours, you can go from your idea to a startup. So for $100, you go to this thing, spend 54 hours, and you have an idea in your head, you come out of there with a startup, with a team, a minimum viable product, you're ready to go. That's amazing. That didn't exist 3 years ago. We talked about today, Kickstarter. There are a lot of different crowdfunding platforms that are being released today. Actually, if you looked at the news today, there's a whole new bill that went into effect today that actually makes this much easier. But anyway, you used to have to, have a loan or a rich uncle to start up something, right? No longer. You can get financing a whole nother way, and that's just the beginning. And then co-working spaces. In Atlanta, there are many co-working spaces. Actually, I counted them this morning. There are 5 within a mile from here. So again, back in the day, if you wanted to start a company, you had to lease some space, lease a room, an office building or something. No longer, you can lease a desk. And this actually happens to be in Nairobi. So from Nairobi to Nepal to New York to Atlanta, there are co-working spaces everywhere. So again, it's so much easier today to start up anything than it ever has been before. And Sarah mentioned this, but Incubator and Accelerator programs. Georgia Tech has a great Accelerator program. Most large organizations, companies, universities, all have an Incubator or Accelerator program where you can get the mentoring and funding that you need to start up something. And what has this led to? This led to a global startup ecosystem, right? This is a map. If you get bored of this talk, just Google Startup Genome, and that's a great site to sort of see this in place. But these are all the sort of major hotspots, kind of hard to see, but all the major hotspots of startup activity around the world. And that's an amazing thing. And so what has that given us? It's given us this. I was actually in Denver just 2 weeks ago and talked to the person who did this study, but in Colorado, they say that the study says that a new startup is launched every 72 hours. Every 72 hours. So question, is that what this is all about? Right? For the last 10 years, all these new tools, is it just about starting a lot of things? Right? Is that what it's really about? I'd suggest no, because 95% of all these fail. Right? 95% of all startups fail. So, startups know how to start, but most struggle with scale, right? all startups know how to start, but they struggle with scale. Now, ironically, big companies know how to scale, but don't know how to start, right? It's true. If you work for either one, you know. So what's the problem? The problem is that each are designed differently. They are designed differently. So startups are all about this, developing assets. Sarah just mentioned this. You don't start with assets. You have no assets. You're developing assets. You're rapidly learning. Everything you do is about speed, right? Explorers on staff and pivoting, changing things, and working very lean. That's what startups are. That's what they know how to do best. Now, on the other side of that, what do big companies know how to do? Big companies, large organizations, they know how to leverage assets. It's all about leveraging your assets, right? Network effects, economies of scale, execution, planning, and everyone thinks big. And a couple people I know here work for Coke. We don't think in hundreds or thousands. It's hundreds of thousands or millions, billions. Big organizations think big. So here's the big. Speaking of big, just Coke. If you're not familiar with Coke, a couple of numbers about Coke. So $17 billion brands. Coke has over 500 brands actually, but 17 of those are billion-dollar brands. We're local in 207 countries. That's more than the UN. There are only 209 countries. I'm always asked, what are the other two, David? Okay, North Korea and Cuba. Those are the two countries that we're not in. So 207 countries, 700,000 employees, so big organization, 20 million customers. So we don't have Coke stores. You don't buy a Coke from a Coke store. You buy it from a retailer. So 20 million retailers that we have. 72 million likes on Facebook. So a lot of people, big audience on Facebook. And the big number, 1.8 billion servings a day. So almost 2 billion people drink something from our company every day, right? We make about 1 million of something a minute. So I'll talk another 5 or 10 minutes, another 5 or 10 million of something. So, huge scale. Now, here's the question. What if we could make it easier for starters to be scalers and scalers to be starters, right? What if we could make it easier for starters to be scalers and scalers to be starters? Now, great question. Actually, does that make sense? Make sense? Yeah. Now, how do you do that, right? How do you do that? How do we do that? How do we do that at Coke? That's what I'm going to walk through now, but I challenge you to think about, if you work for a large organization, how can you do that? Yeah. So here's what we're doing. So we learned right away that we needed a new skill set inside of our company. So we've actually started hiring founders. These are 2 in Sydney. We've launched 8 of these startup teams, founders. We call it our Accelerator Program. And actually, I don't even know what to call it because it's not really an accelerator program, but it's the only name that we can come up with because big companies don't normally do this kind of thing. But we've hired founders to come into our company to build startups inside of our company, right? And these are in 8 cities from Bangalore to Buenos Aires around the world, all around the world. And we've gone right into the startup community. So this one in San Francisco is in a co-working space called WeWork, if you're familiar with San Francisco. And what you can't see are the other 300 startups around them. So this is a tiny slice of an office and a bunch of startups all around them. So we're right in the middle of the community. And the big idea is we have all these assets. So Coke has more trucks on the road than all the delivery services combined. So FedEx, DHL, UPS, all of them combined, we have more vehicles. And so, what do you do with those assets? How could we open up those assets to think about them in different ways? Again, most startups don't start with any kind of assets like this. So opening those up is actually quite interesting. And relationships, it's actually one of my favorite photographs. It's Muhtar Kent, our chairman and CEO. There in the middle, he's shaking hands with Obama and Bono. And this is the kind of relationships Coke has. I mean, it sounds funny, but that guy can pick up the phone and call anyone. And again, if you're a startup, you dream of these kind of assets. You don't have access to these kind of things. And we're working on the big problems that Glenn talked about today. One of them just recently went out. We're looking at creating jobs. How can we make it easier to create jobs, especially for youth? So you're working on these big societal shifts that we see out there. And then we went to, speaking of Startup Weekend, we went to them early on, first, right when we got into this and said, look, we don't want to just write you a check. We want to actually take part. What can we do with Startup Weekend? And they said, well, actually, strangely enough, you're the first non-tech company that has wanted to partner with us. They partnered with Microsoft, Google, and others. And so they said, there's a big need out there with makers, hardware startups, people who make things. And we said, we know how to make things. We have factories. We make stuff. So we're actually sponsoring 10 specifically focused maker events with Startup Weekend around the world. This is the first one that happened last month, actually in Seattle. And then speaking of makers, actually in a couple weeks, the Maker Fair is coming to Atlanta. So we're a sponsor of Maker Fair. How many people are familiar with Maker Fair? So it's trying to get kids, people, to love making stuff. So again, we're partnering with them. And then again, we think globally. So it could be anywhere. So we're doing our first startup weekend in Myanmar. And Myanmar, so we were one of the first companies that went back into Myanmar just recently. And we worked with Startup Weekend. Again, they came to us and said, can you help us get into places that we've never been before? They've been in 100 countries, never been in Myanmar. So we said, yeah, sure. So we're doing a Startup Weekend in Myanmar in actually November. And then we said, okay, here's a thought. Why don't we take all that and bring it inside and see what would happen? So we actually did a Startup Weekend inside Coke. These are Coke employees. And so, we didn't use the same process, all the same things you would do in a Startup Weekend, but inside. We also did something crazy. We created a co-working space inside Coke to create more collaboration across different teams and so forth. And we're doing all kinds of things, all types of experiments in there. Some things are working great, some things are failing miserably, and that's the point, right? So this is one of them. We call it an unconference. Actually, we don't call it that, just called it. Actually, how many people have heard of an unconference? Okay, unconferences are unstructured meetings. You don't have unstructured meetings in a big company, right? Can you imagine that? Come to a meeting, we have no idea what it's going to be about, but that's what we're doing, right? Tomorrow, what's today? Wednesday, we're doing our first failure conference. Failure conference. We're going to celebrate failure. Not really, we're going to celebrate the learning that came out of that failure. But again, imagine being invited to a meeting inside of a company. If you work for a large organization, come celebrate your failure, right? And we're doing that. So, and this last thing, hackathons. Hackathons. Most times you think about hackathons in terms of technology, but you can actually hack anything. These are some students that we worked with in Colorado to come into our factory and hack it to figure out how we can actually use water in a more lean way. But we're doing hackathons all over our system, all over our company on different things. So lastly, last slide here. So if you're in a big company, this is what we're doing, this is what Coke's doing, but if you're in a big organization, not just a company, NGO, anything that you work in, I challenge you and encourage you to think about this. Once we do this, or if we can do this, we can create more scale, right? We can create more scale, more diversity, yeah, and hopefully more revolutions. And I honestly believe this passionately, that we all win when we make it easier for startups to be scalers and scalers to be starters. Thank you.